When a young girl's desperate words silence a courtroom, a corrupt businessman's perfect facade crumbles in an instant. Two simple words that expose years of lies and manipulation. A judge's worst nightmare becomes reality as he realizes the devastating truth behind one of Connecticut's most respected families. This is a story of courage, justice, and the unstoppable power of truth. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you believe in justice, hit that like button and subscribe too. Join our community of truth seekers. The marble halls of Hartford County Courthouse echoed with Sarah Mitchell's footsteps as she walked toward Courtroom 3B. Her heart pounded against her chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. At 14, she wasn't supposed to be here. Not on a Tuesday morning when other kids her age were sitting in math class at Riverside Middle School. Sarah's worn sneakers squeaked against the polished floor as she followed Rachel Torres, her social worker, through the heavy wooden doors. The courtroom was already packed, filled with reporters eager to cover the high-profile case against Richard Bennett, one of Connecticut's most prominent businessmen. Judge William Anderson sat on the bench, his expression stern as he reviewed the documents before him. His salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an air of authority that made Sarah's stomach twist into knots. She'd seen his face in the papers, known for his tough stance on corporate fraud and his reputation for being fair but uncompromising. Richard Bennett sat at the defense table, his expensive suit and confident smile a stark contrast to Sarah's second-hand clothes and trembling hands. His attorney, Catherine Wells, whispered something in his ear and he nodded, shooting a subtle but warning glance in Sarah's direction. "All rise," the bailiff called out. "The court of Hartford County is now in session. The Honorable Judge, William Anderson, presiding." Sarah stood, her legs shaking. Rachel placed a steadying hand on her shoulder as Judge Anderson began speaking. "We're here today to address the allegations of corporate fraud and embezzlement against Mr. Richard Bennett, CEO of Bennett Industries," he announced, his voice filling the courtroom. District Attorney James O'Connor rose from his seat. "Your Honor, before we proceed, we have a late addition to our witness list. Sarah Mitchell, a minor under the protection of social services, has come forward with information directly relevant to this case." Bennett's smile faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered, leaning back in his chair with practiced ease. His attorney immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We weren't notified of any additional witnesses, let alone a minor." Judge Anderson peered over his glasses at Sarah, his expression unreadable. "Mr. O'Connor, explain the relevance of this witness." "Your Honor, Miss Mitchell has been living in one of Bennett Industries' youth centers for the past year. She has first-hand knowledge of how Mr. Bennett has been misappropriating funds meant for foster children's care." Sarah's heart raced as she remembered the night spent in the cramped, underfunded youth center. The moldy walls, the broken heating, the expired food, all while Bennett claimed in public that his centers were state-of-the-art facilities providing top-tier care for Connecticut's most vulnerable children. Judge Anderson considered for a moment, then nodded. "I'll allow it. Miss Mitchell, please approach the stand." As Sarah walked to the witness stand, she caught sight of Maya Chen, her best friend from Riverside Middle School, sitting in the back of the courtroom. Maya gave her a subtle thumbs up, reminding Sarah of their conversation in the school cafeteria last week when she'd finally decided to come forward. The bailiff held out a Bible, and Sarah placed her hand on it, swearing. To tell the truth, her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silent courtroom everyone heard her. Mrs. Foster, the school counselor who had first noticed something was wrong, sat next to Maya, her presence a reminder of how this had all started. It was Mrs. Foster who had connected Sarah with Rachel Torres after noticing the girl's increasing anxiety and declining grades. "Miss Mitchell," District Attorney O'Connor began gently, "can you tell us about your experience at the downtown youth center run by Bennett Industries?" Sarah glanced at Bennett, who maintained his composed facade, but she could see the tension in his jaw. She looked at Rachel, who nodded encouragingly, then at Judge Anderson, whose expression remained neutral but attentive. "The center," Sarah started, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It's nothing like what Mr. Bennett shows in his commercials. We barely get enough food. The building is falling apart. Last winter, the heating broke for 2 weeks, and nobody came to fix it. We had to sleep in our coats." Bennett's attorney stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. These are unsubstantiated claims from a child." "Overruled," Judge Anderson replied, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "Continue, Miss Mitchell." Sarah took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. "But that's not the worst part," she continued. "The worst part is what happens to the money." The courtroom hung on her every word as she described seeing Bennett late one night at the center, arguing with the director about budgets and funding. She recounted the conversation she'd overheard while hiding behind a filing cabinet, terrified of being discovered. He said the government funding was easy money and laughed about how nobody checks where it really goes. He said as long as he keeps donating to the right campaigns, nobody will look too closely at the books. Bennett's composure cracked slightly, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. His attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but he waved her off, his eyes locked on Sarah. "Miss Mitchell," Judge Anderson leaned forward. "These are serious allegations. Are you absolutely certain about what you heard?" Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. This was the moment. Everything hinged on what she would say next. She looked directly at the judge, tears welling in her eyes, but her voice unwavering. Rachel Torres held her breath. Maya Chen crossed her fingers. Mrs. Foster leaned forward in her seat. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Sarah opened her mouth to speak. 2 words. That's all it took to change everything. Sarah locked eyes with Judge Anderson, her heart thundering against her ribs. The weight of every gaze in the courtroom pressed down on her shoulders, but she refused to look away. The truth had been buried for too long. "Call Marcus," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her trembling hands. Judge Anderson's face drained of color. The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Marcus Phillips, the social services director who had mysteriously disappeared 3 months ago after beginning an internal investigation into Bennett Industries youth centers. Richard Bennett's practice smile vanished. His attorney, Catherine Wells, grabbed his arm, but he shrugged her off, rising halfway from his chair before the bailiff's stern look forced him back down. "Your Honor," District Attorney O'Connor stepped forward. "We have evidence that Marcus Phillips was last seen entering Bennett Industries headquarters the night before his disappearance. Phone records show." "Objection!" Wells shot to her feet. "This is pure speculation, Your Honor. Mr. Phillips's disappearance has nothing to do with this case." Judge Anderson raised his hand, silencing both attorneys. His eyes hadn't left Sarah's face. "Miss Mitchell, what do you know about Marcus Phillips?" Sarah's fingers twisted in her lap as she recalled that rainy night in October. The thunder had masked the sound of raised voices coming from Bennett's office at the downtown youth center. She'd been searching for her textbook, left behind. After homework hour, when she heard Marcus Phillips's voice cutting through the storm. "I saw him," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "Mr. Phillips came to the center that night. He had files with him, thick manila folders full of papers. He told Mr. Bennett he had proof of everything, the missing funds, the forged inspection reports, the kickbacks." Bennett's face had turned an ugly shade of red. His attorney scribbled frantically on her legal pad, but Sarah pressed on. "Mr. Bennett offered him money to stay quiet, a lot of money. but Mr. Phillips refused. He said, Sarah paused, swallowing hard. He said the children deserved better, that he wouldn't let Bennett Industries keep profiting off their suffering. Rachel Torres leaned forward in her seat, her social worker's instincts telling her there was more to come. Maya Chen, watching from the back of the courtroom, held her breath. What happened next, Sarah? Judge Anderson's voice was gentle, but firm. Mr. Phillips left with the files. Mr. Bennett made a phone call right after. I heard him say, take care of it. Make sure those files never see daylight. Sarah's voice cracked. The next day, Mr. Phillips was gone. But before he disappeared, he hid something in the center's library. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Anderson banged his gavel, restoring order. Miss Mitchell, are you saying you know where these files are? Sarah nodded slowly. Behind the encyclopedia set, in the reference section nobody ever uses. Mr. Phillips knew the kids were the only ones who actually went in there. The staff never bothered to check. They thought we were all too busy with our phones to read books. District Attorney O'Connor stepped forward.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Your Honor, we request an immediate search of the Downtown Youth Center's library. Absolutely not! Bennett's voice boomed across the courtroom. This is absurd. You're going to take the word of some troubled foster kid over... Mr. Bennett! Judge Anderson's voice cut through the air like a whip. One more outburst, and I'll have you removed from this courtroom. Sarah watched as Judge Anderson conferred quietly with both attorneys. Her testimony had cracked Bennett's perfect facade, but she knew there was more to tell. The files weren't the only evidence she had. Rachel had helped her gather everything. Photographs of the center's conditions, recordings of conversations, copies of doctored financial reports she'd found while cleaning the office. For months, they'd built their case in secret, knowing they'd only get one chance to expose the truth. Judge Anderson straightened in his chair, addressing the courtroom. In light of this testimony, I'm ordering an immediate recess. The Hartford Police Department will conduct a search of the Downtown Youth Center's library. We'll reconvene when... She's lying. Bennett's control finally snapped. He lunged forward, pointing at Sarah. You little brat, do you have any idea what you've done? I gave you ungrateful kids everything. Without me, you'd all be on the streets. The bailiff moved quickly, but not before Bennett's true nature was exposed for all to see. As he was restrained, Sarah noticed Judge Anderson watching the scene with a mix of disgust and determination. Mrs. Foster, the school counselor who had first noticed Sarah's distress, wiped tears from her eyes. She remembered the day Sarah had finally broken down in her office, revealing snippets of what was happening at the center. If she had known the full scope then. Maya Chen slipped out of the courtroom, pulling out her phone. As Sarah's best friend and the daughter of a local newspaper editor, she knew exactly how to ensure this story wouldn't be buried. Within minutes, her father's newsroom would be all over the case. Back in the courtroom, Sarah remained composed on the witness stand, even as Bennett was escorted out. She caught Rachel's proud smile and felt a warmth in her chest. For the first time since entering the foster system, she felt truly seen and heard. Judge Anderson cleared his throat. Miss Mitchell, the court thanks you for your courage today. However, I need to ask, do you feel safe returning to the Downtown Youth Center? Before Sarah could answer, Rachel Torres stood up. Your Honor, I've already begun paperwork to have Sarah transferred to a different facility, one not associated with Bennett Industries. The judge nodded approvingly. Very well. Court is in recess until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Miss Mitchell, please remain available for further testimony. As Sarah stepped down from the witness stand, her legs felt wobbly. Rachel was immediately at her side, steadying her. Together, they walked past the press gathering outside the courtroom doors, ignoring the barrage of questions. In the quiet, Of the courthouse hallway, Sarah finally let out the breath she'd been holding. "Do you think they'll find the files?" Rachel squeezed her shoulder. "Marcus Phillips was smart. If he hid them where you say he did, they'll find them. But even without the files, your testimony today changed everything." Bennett's mask slipped, and everyone saw what was underneath. Sarah nodded, remembering the anger in Bennett's eyes, so different from his usual carefully crafted public persona. "What happens now?" "Now," Rachel said, guiding her toward the exit. "We keep fighting. The truth is finally coming out, and there's no stopping it." Outside, the autumn sun was setting over Hartford, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Sarah paused on the courthouse steps, thinking about all the other kids still in Bennett's centers. Soon, they would have a chance at something better. Maya was waiting by Rachel's car, her phone buzzing constantly with news alerts. "Sarah, you're trending. People are already sharing stories about other Bennett Industries facilities. You started something big." Sarah managed a small smile. The weight of the day's events was catching up with her, but there was also a sense of relief. The secret she'd carried for so long was finally out in the open. As they drove away from the courthouse, Sarah caught a glimpse of Bennett being led to a police car. His perfect suit wrinkled, his composure completely shattered. She thought about Marcus Phillips, wondering if this would help find him, bring him justice. Rachel seemed to read her thoughts. The police will reopen Marcus's case now. With everything coming to light, they'll have to investigate his disappearance properly. Sarah leaned back in her seat, exhausted but hopeful. 2 words. Call Marcus had been all it took to start unraveling years of corruption and abuse. She thought about all the nights she'd spent afraid to speak up, all the times she'd convinced herself that no one would believe her. But someone had believed her. Rachel had believed her. Mrs. Foster had believed her. Maya had believed her. And now, finally, Judge Anderson believed her too. The sun disappeared behind Hartford's skyline as they drove toward the temporary shelter where Sarah would stay until a new placement could be arranged. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more testimony, more challenges. But for now, she had done what she'd thought impossible. She'd spoken the truth, and the world had listened. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Riverside Middle School's cafeteria as Sarah picked at her lunch, surrounded by the usual chaos of middle school life. Maya sat beside her, scrolling through news updates about yesterday's courtroom. Revelation. "They found them," Maya whispered, sliding her phone across the table. "The files. They were exactly where you said they'd be." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the headline, "Missing Social Services Director's Files Recovered. Bennett Industries Under Federal Investigation." The photograph showed police officers carrying boxes of documents from the downtown youth center's library. Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Foster appeared at their table, her expression serious. "Sarah, Rachel Torres is here to see you. She's waiting in my office." The walk to the counselor's office felt surreal. Students whispered as she passed, some pointing at their phones where her story was trending. Sarah kept her head high, remembering Judge Anderson's words about courage. Rachel stood when Sarah entered, her face tense with urgency. "The FBI just arrested Bennett's head of security, Thomas Reeves. He's talking, Sarah. He knows what happened to Marcus Phillips." Sarah sank into a chair, her mind racing back to that stormy October night. She hadn't told anyone about seeing Thomas Reeves at the center after Marcus left. The memory had haunted her for months. "There's more," Rachel continued, sitting beside her. "They found offshore accounts, millions in embezzled funds. But Bennett's disappeared. They went to arrest him this morning and he was gone." Mrs. Foster closed the office door, blocking out the hallway noise. "Should we be worried about Sarah's safety?" Rachel nodded grimly. "We're moving her to a safe house tonight. The FBI believes Bennett might try to silence anyone who can testify against him." Sarah's throat tightened. What about the other kids at the center and Maya? She helped me gather evidence. They're relocating everyone from Bennett's facilities, Rachel assured her, and Maya's family is being offered protection. But Sarah, we need you to tell the FBI everything you remember about that night. Every detail could help them find Bennett. Sarah closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember. The thunder, the raised voices, the sound of a car starting in the rain, and something else, something she hadn't told anyone yet. There was a phone call, she said slowly. After Marcus left, but before Mr. Reeves arrived, Bennett was talking about a place called Silver Lake Lodge. He said it would be ready if needed. Rachel quickly typed the information into her phone. Silver Lake, that's up near the Massachusetts border. Bennett's family used to own property there. Mrs. Foster leaned forward. Sarah, are you sure you want to continue with this? Nobody would blame you for stepping back. Sarah thought about all the other kids in the system, about Marcus Phillips who'd tried to help them, about the years of lies and stolen futures. I'm sure Bennett needs to face justice. The rest of the school day passed in a blur. By afternoon, news helicopters circled overhead as FBI agents escorted Sarah and Maya to waiting vehicles. Their families would be separated for safety, moved to different locations until Bennett was caught. Maya hugged Sarah tightly before they parted. Be careful, okay? And remember, you're not alone in this anymore. As Rachel drove Sarah to the safe house, they listened to the radio coverage. Bennett's empire was crumbling. Other witnesses were coming forward. Former employees, contractors, even local officials who'd been paid to look the other way. The safe house was a small cabin in the woods, far from Hartford's busy streets. FBI agents patrolled the perimeter while Sarah and Rachel settled inside. Through the window, Sarah watched the sunset paint the trees gold, thinking about how much had changed in just 2 days. You should try to get some sleep, Rachel suggested, but Sarah shook her head. I keep thinking about Marcus. Do you think he's still alive? Rachel sat beside her on the window seat. Thomas Reeves is cooperating with the FBI. If anyone knows what happened to Marcus, it's him. Suddenly, Sarah sat up straighter. The lodge, Silver Lake Lodge. What if that's where Marcus is? What if Bennett's keeping him there? The FBI is already checking it out, Rachel assured her. They've got teams heading there now. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. She remembered Bennett's words on the phone that night. Make sure those files never see daylight. Not destroy them, just keep them hidden. Rachel, she said slowly, what if the files we found weren't all of them? What if Marcus hid copies somewhere else? Somewhere Bennett would never think to look. Rachel considered this. It would make sense. Marcus was thorough. He wouldn't risk keeping all the evidence in one place. Sarah's mind raced. The day before he disappeared, Marcus came to the center to help with homework. He was different, nervous. He kept looking at the books in the library, but not the reference section. He was in the fiction area. Rachel was already on the phone with the FBI. Within hours, agents were back at the downtown youth center, this time combing through the fiction section. They found it hidden inside an old copy of The Secret Garden, a USB drive containing duplicates of every document, plus video recordings of Bennett's illegal activities. As night fell, Sarah finally dozed off on the cabin's couch, exhausted but determined. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more revelations. But for now, she had done what she could to help find Marcus and bring Bennett to justice. In Hartford, Judge Anderson sat late in his chambers, reviewing the new evidence. His face was grim as he signed the warrants that would help dismantle Bennett's criminal network. The judge thought about Sarah's courage, about how 2 simple words had started an avalanche of truth. Somewhere in the darkness, Richard Bennett was running, but his time was running out. The truth had a way of catching up, and Sarah Mitchell had made sure it wouldn't stay buried any longer. Dawn broke over the safe house as FBI radios crackled with urgent updates. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate, listening to Rachel coordinate with the agents outside. "They've found something at Silver Lake Lodge," Rachel announced, lowering her phone. "Signs of recent activity. Someone's been there within the last 24 hours. Sarah's heart raced as she remembered the USB drive's contents. Among the files had been a blueprint of Silver Lake Lodge, with strange markings in the basement area. The FBI's forensic team had worked through the night, analyzing everything from the hidden drive. A sharp knock at the door made them both jump. Agent Diana Chen, Maya's mother, entered with a stack of surveillance photos. "We've got confirmation. Bennett was spotted at a gas station near the Massachusetts border 3 hours ago. He's heading north." Sarah studied the grainy image of Bennett buying supplies. His expensive suit was replaced by casual clothes, his clean-shaven face now covered in stubble. But his eyes held the same cold determination she remembered from that night at the youth center. "There's something else," Agent Chen continued, spreading more photos across the table. Security footage from the youth center showed someone entering the library last week after hours using Bennett's access code. The footage showed a familiar figure, Catherine Wells, Bennett's attorney. In the video, she moved purposefully through the stacks, checking specific books. She was looking for the USB drive, Sarah realized. She knew it had to be there somewhere, but she didn't know which book. Rachel's phone buzzed with a text. Her face paled as she read it. "Thomas, Reeves just told the FBI where to find Marcus Phillips." The room fell silent. Sarah's hands began to shake. "Is he?" "He's alive," Rachel said quickly. "But he's being held at a private medical facility upstate. Bennett's been keeping him sedated for months." Agent Chen was already mobilizing a rescue team. Sarah listened as coordinates were shared, tactical plans discussed. Through it all, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. "Wait," she said suddenly. "The blueprint on the USB drive. There was a tunnel marked in the basement of Silver Lake Lodge. What if it connects to somewhere else?" Agent Chen pulled up the blueprint on her tablet. The tunnel extended beyond the edge of the drawing, its destination unmarked. "The medical facility," Rachel breathed. "That's how Bennett's been moving around without being seen. The tunnel must connect to where they're keeping Marcus." Sarah remembered something else from that rainy night. Bennett made another call right before Mr. Reeves arrived. He said something about the backup plan and the doctor. Agent Chen's fingers flew across her tablet. "Dr. James Morrison. He owns the medical facility where Reeves says they're keeping Phillips. He's also on Bennett's payroll." The pieces were falling into place. Bennett wasn't running. He was executing a carefully planned escape route. The gas station sighting was a diversion. "He's going to try to move Marcus through the tunnel," Sarah said, "before the FBI can reach the medical facility." Rachel and Agent Chen exchanged looks. This was bigger than anyone had realized. Bennett hadn't just been stealing money. He'd built an entire underground network for covering up his crimes. The safe house erupted into activity. Tactical teams were redirected, surveillance drones deployed. Sarah watched through the window. As more FBI vehicles arrived, agents gearing up for what could be the final confrontation. "Sarah," Rachel said gently, "you've done more than enough. You should rest now. Let the FBI handle this." But Sarah shook her head. "Marcus tried to help us. He risked everything to expose the truth. I need to see this through." Agent Chen considered for a moment, then nodded. "Stay with Rachel. I'll keep you updated on everything that happens." Hours passed like molasses. Sarah paced the safe house, jumping at every phone call, every radio crackle. Maya sent encrypted messages through a secure app, sharing what she'd learned from her father's newspaper contacts. Just after noon, the radio came alive with urgent voices. "Target spotted entering tunnel access point. Teams in position at both." Ends, standing by for orders. Sarah held her breath. In her mind, she saw Bennett moving through the dark tunnel, desperate and dangerous. Would he surrender when he realized he was trapped, or would he rather go down fighting? Movement at the medical facility exit, a voice reported. Multiple heat signatures approaching from the north end of the tunnel. Rachel gripped Sarah's hand as they listened. The next few minutes would determine everything. Suddenly, gunshots echoed through the radio. Shouts and commands blurred together. Sarah's heart pounded so hard she could barely hear the transmission. Then silence. Agent Chen's voice cut through the quiet. Target in custody. Marcus Phillips secured. Medical team en route. Sarah collapsed into a chair, tears streaming down her face. Rachel hugged her tightly, her own eyes glistening. It's over, Rachel whispered. You did it, Sarah. You brought him down. But it wasn't quite over. There would be more court appearances, more testimonies. The full scope of Bennett's crimes was still being uncovered. Other corrupt officials would be exposed. More victims would come forward. Yet something had fundamentally changed. The truth had finally broken through years of lies and manipulation. A young girl's courage had shattered a powerful man's carefully constructed world. As the sun set on that momentous day, Sarah stood at the safe house window, watching FBI vehicles return from the operation. She thought about all the other kids in the system, about how things might be different now. Maya's latest message summed it up perfectly. You gave everyone a voice, Sarah. 2 words in that courtroom, and nothing will ever be the same. In his hospital room, Marcus Phillips was already giving his statement to federal prosecutors, filling in the missing pieces of Bennett's criminal empire. And in a holding cell, Richard Bennett sat in silence, his perfect world reduced to concrete. Walls and steel bars. Judge Anderson, hearing of the day's events, pulled out the case file that had started it all. On top was the transcript of Sarah's testimony. Those 2 fateful words that had changed everything. Call Marcus. The judge smiled, knowing that tomorrow's hearing would be very different. Justice, so long delayed, was finally being served. The fluorescent lights of Hartford General Hospital cast harsh shadows as Sarah and Rachel made their way down the sterile corridor toward Marcus Phillips's room. 2 FBI agents stood guard outside, nodding in recognition as they approached. Marcus sat propped up in the hospital bed, still pale but alert. His eyes lit up when he saw Sarah. You must be the brave young lady I've been hearing about. Sarah stepped forward hesitantly. The man who had risked everything to protect foster children like her looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by months of captivity. Yet his voice carried the same strength she'd heard that night at the youth. Center, the files you hid, she said softly. I found them, both copies. Marcus smiled. I knew the kids were the only ones who still read actual books. Bennett's people would never think to look there. Rachel touched Sarah's shoulder. Marcus has agreed to testify at tomorrow's hearing. Bennett's whole operation is going to be exposed. A knock at the door interrupted them. Agent Chen entered, her expression serious. We've got a problem. Catherine Wells is trying to negotiate a plea deal for Bennett. She's claiming Marcus was involved in the embezzlement. Marcus struggled to sit up straighter. That's impossible. I have proof. We know, Agent Chen assured him. But Wells is good at manipulating evidence. She's already submitted documents to Judge Anderson suggesting you were taking bribes. Sarah felt her chest tighten. After everything they'd been through, Bennett was still trying to twist the truth. The offshore accounts, she blurted out. The ones from the USB drive. They weren't just for stealing money, were they? Marcus shook his head. Bennett was laundering money for half the corrupt officials in Connecticut. That's why they protected him for so long. Agent Chen's phone buzzed. Her eyes widened as she read the message. Wells just filed a motion to suppress the USB drive evidence, claiming it was obtained illegally. Rachel paced the small room. She's trying to discredit everything before the hearing. If Judge Anderson grants the motion, he won't, Sarah interrupted. Her voice was quiet but determined. Because I recorded the night Bennett caught me finding the drive. The room fell silent. Sarah pulled out her old phone, the one she'd kept hidden even after being moved to the safe house. He threatened me, admitted everything. I was so scared I hit record without even thinking about it. Agent Chen took the phone carefully. This could change everything. But Sarah, you'll have to testify again. Explain why you didn't come forward with this earlier. Sarah looked at Marcus, remembering his courage in standing up to Bennett. I'm not afraid anymore. The truth needs to be heard. As evening approached, the hospital room became a command center. Federal prosecutors came and went, preparing for the next day's hearing. Sarah's recording was analyzed, authenticated, and added to the growing mountain of evidence against Bennett and his conspirators. Maya texted updates from her father's newsroom. More victims were coming forward, sharing stories of abuse and neglect from Bennett's facilities across the state. The scandal was growing beyond anyone's expectations. Mrs. Foster arrived with dinner for everyone, her counselor's instincts telling her they needed more than just legal support. She sat with Sarah while the adults discussed strategy, offering quiet encouragement and understanding. Tomorrow will be tough, she said gently, but remember why you started this. Think about all the kids who will have better lives because you were brave enough to speak up. As night fell over Hartford, Sarah stood at the hospital window, watching the city lights flicker on. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more attempts by Bennett and his allies to escape justice. But something had shifted inside her. Those 2 words in the courtroom, call Marcus, had been just the beginning. Now she had found her voice, and she intended to use it. In his chambers, Judge Anderson reviewed the new evidence late into the night. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined, threatening to shake Connecticut's power structure to its core. But as he listened to Sarah's recording, he knew there could be no turning back. Justice was coming, one truth at a time. The marble walls of Hartford County Courthouse seemed colder this morning as Sarah walked through security. News vans lined the street outside, reporters clamoring for the latest updates on the Bennett scandal. Inside Courtroom 3B, Catherine Wells sat at the defense table, her perfectly pressed suit a stark contrast to Bennett's orange jumpsuit. She whispered urgently to her client, shooting calculated glances at Sarah as she entered. Marcus Phillips waited near the prosecutor's table, still pale but standing tall. His presence sent a ripple through the crowded courtroom. Many had thought him dead, another victim of Bennett's ruthless empire. Judge Anderson entered, his face grave. Before we begin, I'd like to address the defense's motion to suppress evidence from the USB drive. Wells rose smoothly. Your Honor, the drive was obtained without proper authorization. Any evidence derived from it should be inadmissible. District Attorney O'Connor stood. Your Honor, we have new evidence regarding the circumstances under which this drive was discovered. Sarah watched as her phone recording was played for the court. Bennett's voice filled the room, threatening and cold. The gallery fell silent as they listened to him inadvertently confess to his crimes while trying to intimidate a 14-year-old girl. Wells's composure cracked slightly. She hadn't known about this recording. Neither had Bennett, whose face had turned an alarming shade of red. Furthermore, O'Connor continued, we have testimony from Dr. James Morrison, who has agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. He'll detail how Bennett used the medical facility to hold Marcus Phillips against his will. Judge Anderson's eyes narrowed. Ms. Wells, in light of this new evidence, do you wish to revise your motion? Before Wells could respond, Bennett stood abruptly. This is all a setup. That brat is lying and Phillips was in on it from the start. They're trying to destroy everything I built." The judge banged his gavel. "Mr. Bennett, control yourself or you'll be removed from this courtroom." Sarah felt Rachel's supportive hand on her shoulder as she prepared to testify again. This time would be different. This time, she had more than just words. She had proof. The truth was finally fighting back, one piece of evidence at a time. Maya's father's newspaper had broken another story that morning, documentation of payoffs to state officials who had looked the other way while Bennett emptied the youth center's accounts. The web of corruption was unraveling faster than anyone could have predicted. Sarah took the stand, her voice stronger than before. She detailed finding the USB drive, making the recording, the nights spent gathering evidence while living in fear of discovery. Wells tried to shake her testimony through cross-examination, suggesting she had been manipulated by Marcus Phillips into making false accusations. But Sarah remained steady, her responses clear and unwavering. "Mr. Phillips never asked me to do anything," she explained. "He tried to help us and Bennett tried to silence him. That's the truth." As the day progressed, more witnesses came forward. Former employees testified about falsified records. A computer forensics expert detailed the money trail through offshore accounts. Dr. Morrison described the facility where Marcus had been held. But it was Marcus's testimony that changed everything. Despite months of captivity, his mind remained sharp. He laid out Bennett's entire operation, supported by years of carefully gathered evidence. "The youth centers were just the beginning," Marcus explained. "Bennett had built a network of corrupt officials, each taking their cut while vulnerable children suffered. When I threatened to expose it, he didn't just try to silence me, he made an example of me." The courtroom fell silent as Marcus described his ordeal. Sarah watched Bennett's face, seeing the mask of respectability crumble completely. Wells made a desperate attempt to salvage her case, but the evidence was overwhelming. Even her usual courtroom theatrics fell flat in the face of such damning proof. Judge Anderson called a recess to review the new testimony. In the courthouse hallway, Sarah found herself surrounded by other foster kids from Bennett's facilities. They had come to support her, each with their own story to tell. Rachel watched proudly as Sarah listened to their experiences, offering encouragement and understanding. The scared girl who had whispered 2 words in this courthouse was becoming a voice for all those who had been silenced. Maya arrived with afternoon newspapers, their headlines screaming about the growing scandal. More officials were resigning. Investigations were spreading to other states, and Bennett's carefully constructed empire was collapsing like a house of cards. When court resumed, Judge Anderson's expression was thunderous. The evidence had painted a picture of corruption and cruelty that demanded justice. Wells made one last attempt to save her client, offering to reveal names of other corrupt officials in exchange for a lighter sentence. But it was too late. The truth had gained too much momentum to be stopped. As the judge prepared to rule, Sarah caught Marcus's eye. He nodded slightly, acknowledging what they had achieved together. Sometimes the smallest act of courage could start an avalanche of change. The truth was finally having its day in court, and no amount of money or power could stop it now. Judge Anderson's gavel echoed through courtroom 3B as he delivered his ruling. The evidence against Richard Bennett was insurmountable. Financial fraud, kidnapping, child endangerment, and criminal conspiracy. Given the severity and scope of these crimes, Judge Anderson declared, this court sentences Richard Bennett to 30 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Bennett's face contorted with rage as federal marshals approached to take him into custody. "You'll regret this," he snarled, glaring at Sarah. "All of you." Catherine Wells quickly gathered her papers, her stellar reputation in tatters. The corruption she'd helped conceal would likely end her legal career. Sarah sat between Rachel and Maya, watching as Bennett was led away. His expensive suit and polished demeanor couldn't hide his true nature anymore. Marcus Phillips approached them slowly, still recovering from his ordeal. "Sarah, there's something you should know. During my captivity, I discovered evidence of other facilities, other children who need help." Rachel leaned forward. "What kind of facilities?" "Bennett's network extends beyond Connecticut," Marcus explained. "He has connections to youth, centers in 5 other states, all operating under different company names." Agent Chen joined their conversation, her tablet displaying a web of shell companies and false identities. "We've already started investigating. The FBI is coordinating with authorities in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania." Sarah thought about all the other kids still trapped in Bennett's system. "How can I help?" "Me? Your testimony was just the beginning," Marcus said. "We need to show other children they can speak up, that someone will listen." Mrs. Foster arrived with news from the school district. The story's spreading. Kids from other facilities are coming forward, sharing their experiences. Maya's phone buzzed with updates from her father's newsroom. "Dad says the governor's launching a full investigation into the state's foster care system. They're talking about complete reform." Rachel touched Sarah's shoulder gently. "This is bigger than just Bennett now. It's about changing the whole system." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of what they'd started. Those 2 words in court had unleashed a flood of truth that couldn't be contained. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. Sarah watched as Marcus stepped forward to address them, his voice steady despite his recent captivity. "For years, Richard Bennett preyed on society's most vulnerable children," he declared. "Today, thanks to the courage of one young girl, his empire of exploitation has crumbled." The headlines would tell of Bennett's downfall, but the real story was just beginning. Across multiple states, investigations were uncovering decades of systematic abuse and corruption. Sarah returned to Riverside Middle School the following week, no longer the scared girl hiding in the shadows. Other students looked at her differently now, not with pity, but with respect. Maya organized a support group for foster kids, creating a safe space for sharing experiences and finding strength in unity. Mrs. Foster provided guidance, helping them navigate the emotional aftermath of their ordeal. Rachel worked tirelessly with Marcus and the FBI, using their evidence to identify and protect other victims of Bennett's network. Each new revelation brought them closer to dismantling the entire corrupt system. Judge Anderson called Sarah to his chambers one afternoon. His usually stern face softened as he spoke. "Your courage has inspired others to come forward. Sometimes justice needs a young voice to speak the truth." The state legislature began drafting new laws to protect foster children, with Marcus serving as a key advisor. They called it the Sarah's Law, comprehensive reform, ensuring transparency and accountability in the foster care system. Late one evening, as Sarah sat doing homework in her new foster home, a warm, caring environment Rachel had personally vetted, she received a text from Maya. "Dad's paper just broke another story," it read. 3 more corrupt officials arrested. This is really happening." Sarah smiled, remembering the moment everything changed. 2 words had shattered Bennett's facade, but it was the avalanche of truth that followed that would create lasting change. The system that had failed so many children was finally being held accountable, one revelation at a time. And somewhere, in Hartford County Courthouse, Judge Anderson added another file to the growing case that started with a young girl's courage to speak up. 1 year after Sarah's testimony on Capitol Hill, the landscape of foster care in America had transformed. The Sarah Mitchell Foster Care Reform Act passed with bipartisan support, establishing strict oversight and protection for children in the system. Governor Thompson signed Connecticut's version of the law in a ceremony at Hartford County Courthouse. Sarah stood beside Judge Anderson, watching as the legislation that bore her name became reality. The marble halls that once felt cold and intimidating now represented hope and change. "This law ensures that no child's voice goes unheard," the governor declared. "No more corruption, no more silence, no more exploitation of our most vulnerable citizens." Marcus Phillips, now heading the state's new Foster Care Oversight Commission, presented Sarah with the pen used to sign the bill. His hands, once weakened by months of captivity, were steady and strong. "Your 2 words in this courthouse started a revolution in child welfare. Today, we ensure that revolution becomes permanent." Rachel squeezed Sarah's hand as cameras flashed. They had become more than just social worker and former foster child. They were family now. The adoption papers finally approved last month. Sarah Rachel Torres. Each part of her name told a story of transformation and triumph. Maya, still her closest friend, documented the ceremony for her father's newspaper. Their investigation into foster care abuse had won a Pulitzer Prize, bringing national attention to the cause. Maya's lens captured not just the official moments, but the quiet exchanges, the determined faces of survivors who had gathered to witness history. Mrs. Foster watched from the audience, remembering the quiet girl who had first confided in her. That girl had grown into a powerful advocate, speaking for those still finding their voice. She thought about all the other students who had since come forward, drawing courage from Sarah's example. After the ceremony, Sarah visited Bennett's former youth center, now transformed into a model facility under new management. Children played in well-maintained rooms, their artwork decorating freshly painted walls. The musty odors and broken furniture were gone, replaced by bright colors and comfortable spaces. "Sometimes I can't believe how different it looks," Sarah told Rachel as they walked the halls. "It feels like another world." They passed the spot where she had hidden to record Bennett's threats, now transformed into a cozy reading nook. In every room, evidence of positive change was visible. The kitchen, once barely functional, now served nutritious meals. The dormitories had new beds and personal storage spaces for each child. Even the air felt different, lighter, filled with laughter instead of fear. Agent Chen joined them, sharing updates on the FBI's continuing investigation. "We've shut down 15 corrupt networks nationwide. Your testimony helped create the framework for identifying these operations." She showed them a map marking each exposed facility, each representing dozens of children freed from exploitation. Sarah paused at the library, now filled with new books and comfortable reading spaces. The hidden USB drive that had started everything was preserved in the courthouse archives, a reminder of how truth could overcome power. Students now learned about digital evidence and documentation as part of their empowerment training. Marcus's office at the Oversight Commission displayed photos of successful prosecutions, corrupt officials, negligent administrators, all brought to justice because one girl refused to stay silent. Each image told a story of accountability, of systems changed and lives improved. The walls also featured artwork from foster children, their creative expressions no longer suppressed. One painting showed a courthouse with rays of light breaking through storm clouds, a child's interpretation of the day. Sarah spoke those 2 fateful words. Judge Anderson had framed the transcript of that pivotal day in his courtroom, those 2 words that changed everything. He shared it with new judges as a reminder that justice often comes from unexpected sources. The document had become part of training materials for judicial appointments nationwide. In her new home with Rachel, Sarah kept a journal of letters from other foster children who had found courage in her story. Each one represented another voice refusing to be silenced. The letters came from across the country, some written in crayon, others in careful cursive, all carrying messages of hope and determination. Rachel had converted their spare room into a small office where she coordinated with advocacy groups. The walls were covered with photos of successful reunifications, adoptions, and program graduations. Each image represented a life touched by the reforms Sarah had helped create. The evening news highlighted another conviction stemming from the ongoing investigations. Bennett's network had spread further than anyone imagined, but piece by piece, it was being dismantled. The reporter mentioned Sarah's law as the catalyst for these continuing discoveries. Maya organized youth advocacy groups in schools across Connecticut, creating safe spaces for kids to share their experiences and seek help. The culture of silence was breaking down, replaced by a movement of empowerment. Weekly meetings drew increasing numbers of students ready to speak their truth. These groups produced newsletters, artwork, and even a podcast series about foster care reform. Sarah occasionally spoke at their events, sharing her story and encouraging others to find their voice. The impact rippled through school districts, changing how educators approach signs of abuse or neglect. Sarah's story became part of training programs for social workers, teaching them to recognize signs of systematic abuse and corruption. Rachel led these sessions, ensuring new professionals entered the field with awareness and commitment. The curriculum included case studies from Bennett's network as examples of what to watch for. The courthouse, where everything began now, hosted regular forums on child welfare reform. Sarah often spoke at these events, her quiet strength inspiring others to take action. The same room where she had first faced Bennett now served as a place of healing and empowerment for countless others. International observers came to study the reforms, looking to replicate Connecticut's success in their own countries. Sarah's law became a model for child protection legislation worldwide. The ripple effects of those two words continued to spread, crossing borders and changing lives. As sunset painted Hartford's skyline, Sarah stood with her new family: Rachel, Maya, Marcus, Mrs. Foster, and countless others who had joined her. Fight for justice. Together they had proven that truth could overcome any obstacle, that courage could spark lasting change. The system that had failed so many was being rebuilt, stronger and more accountable. And it all started with a young girl who dared to speak two words in a courtroom, words that would echo through the halls of justice for years to come. The transformation wasn't just in laws and buildings, it was in the eyes of foster children who now looked to the future with hope instead of fear. It was in the determination of social workers armed with better tools and training. It was in the commitment of judges and prosecutors who remembered that justice sometimes speaks in a whisper. Sarah's journey from scared witness to powerful advocate inspired a new generation of voices refusing to be silenced. Her story taught them that change was possible, that truth had power, and that sometimes the bravest act was simply speaking up. 10 years had passed since those two words changed everything in Courtroom 3B. The Hartford County Courthouse was hosting a special ceremony marking the decade of reform sparked by Sarah Mitchell's testimony. Now 24, Sarah adjusted her business suit as she prepared to address the gathered crowd. Through the courthouse windows, she could see hundreds of people assembled. Foster care advocates, survivors, social workers, and families touched by the reforms she'd helped create. Judge Anderson, his hair now completely white, but his eyes, still sharp, stood at the podium. 10 years ago, a young girl's courage transformed our nation's foster care system. Today, we celebrate not just the changes she inspired, but the thousands of lives saved because she dared to speak the truth. The grand hall was filled with faces both familiar and new. Rachel Torres, now Sarah's adopted mother and the state's Director of Child Welfare Services, sat in the front row. Beside her was Maya Chen, who had turned her father's Pulitzer-winning investigation into a career as a civil rights attorney. Marcus Phillips, despite offers from national organizations, had remained in Connecticut overseeing the Foster Care Oversight Commission. His work had become a model for programs across the country. Mrs. Foster, recently retired but still mentoring at-risk youth, dabbed tears from her eyes as she watched her former student approach the podium. Sarah took a deep breath, looking out over the assembled crowd. 10 years ago, I stood in this courthouse and spoke 2 words that changed my life. Today, I'm here to share 2 different words. Thank you. The ceremony marked more than just an anniversary. Governor Thompson was signing expanded legislation, strengthening protections for foster children and increasing funding for oversight programs. The Sarah's Law model had been adopted by 47 states, with federal mandates ensuring consistent standards nationwide. But the day's most significant moment wasn't on the official program. As Sarah concluded her speech, a group of teenagers walked onto the stage. Each wore a t-shirt bearing the words, "Truth Speaks," the name of the youth advocacy organization Sarah had founded 5 years ago. When I was 14, Sarah continued, I thought I was alone. Today, I want to introduce you to the next generation of voices refusing to be silenced. One by one, the teens stepped forward, sharing their stories of survival and transformation. They came from former Bennett facilities, from other exposed corruption networks, from a system that had been reborn through accountability and transparency. Among them was Lisa Chen, Maya's younger sister, who had been inspired to become a social worker after witnessing Sarah's impact. Now she worked with recently rescued trafficking victims, helping them find their voices. Marcus joined Sarah at the podium, unfolding a document that brought gasps from the audience. The FBI has just concluded its decade-long investigation into foster care corruption. The final numbers are staggering. Over 500 convictions, 32 criminal networks dismantled, and more than 20,000 children protected from exploitation. Rachel watched proudly as her daughter, because that's what Sarah truly was now, handled the waves of emotion flowing through the room. The scared girl who had hidden in the library was now a beacon of hope for others trapped in darkness. The ceremony took an unexpected turn when FBI agent Chen stepped forward with breaking news. Richard Bennett, serving his 30-year sentence, had finally confessed to orchestrating dozens more corruption schemes. His detailed testimony would lead to additional prosecutions and recoveries of stolen funds. The money recovered will establish a trust fund, Agent Chen announced, providing educational scholarships for foster children nationwide. In accordance with federal guidelines, it will be named the Mitchell Phillips Educational Foundation. Sarah hadn't known about this development. She gripped the podium, emotion threatening to overwhelm her as she thought about how many lives would be changed by this opportunity. Judge Anderson rose again, his voice carrying the weight of a decade's perspective. 10 years ago, I heard 2 words that altered the course of justice. Today, we witness how truth, once spoken, cannot be contained. The ceremony shifted to the courthouse steps, where a permanent memorial was being unveiled. A bronze sculpture showed a young girl standing tall, her hand reaching toward a light breaking through clouds. The plaque bore a simple inscription, "Courage Speaks." Rachel joined Sarah at the memorial, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shoulders. They had faced countless challenges over the past decade. Threats from Bennett's remaining allies, resistance from corrupt officials, the emotional toll of helping other survivors heal. But they had also witnessed extraordinary transformations. The downtown youth center, once a symbol of exploitation, now housed the country's most successful rehabilitation program for traumatized foster children. Its success rate in placing children in stable, loving homes had become legendary. Maya's legal advocacy had expanded beyond Connecticut, establishing precedents that made it easier to prosecute institutional abuse. Her firm specialized in representing foster children, never charging them fees, supported by the recoveries from successful prosecutions of corrupt administrators. Mrs. Foster's mentoring program had spread to schools nationwide, training teachers to recognize signs of systematic abuse and empowering students to speak up. She had written a curriculum now mandatory in education degree programs. Marcus Phillips, despite numerous death threats, had never stopped investigating corruption in child welfare systems. His methodical approach to gathering evidence had become standard procedure for federal investigators. The Truth Speaks teenagers gathered around Sarah, their energy and determination reminding her of herself at their age. Each had a story of survival, but more importantly, each had a vision for continuing the fight for justice. Lisa Chen stepped forward, holding up her phone. The live stream of today's ceremony has gone viral. Your Sarah's Law is trending worldwide. People are sharing their own stories of speaking up against corruption. Governor Thompson joined the group, carrying a thick folder. The latest statistics just came in. Since Sarah's Law was implemented, reported cases of institutional abuse have increased by 800%. But actual incidents have decreased by 90%, Marcus added. People are reporting because they know they'll be heard. Abusers can no longer hide behind their power. Sarah looked out over the crowd still gathering on the courthouse steps. Reporters from around the world, mixed with local families, all drawn by the power of a story that began with 2 words spoken by a frightened teenager. Rachel squeezed her daughter's hand. Want to tell them what's next? Sarah nodded, stepping back to the microphone. Today we celebrate a decade of progress, but our work isn't finished. Thanks to the Mitchell Phillips Foundation, we're launching a nationwide network of advocacy centers. The crowd quieted as she continued. These centers will provide legal support, counseling, education, and most importantly, a platform for voices that have been silenced. Every child deserves to be heard. Every truth deserves to be spoken. The sun was setting over Hartford as the ceremony concluded. The courthouse steps began to clear, but small groups lingered, sharing stories and making connections. The ripple effect of truth continued to spread. Inside, Judge Anderson sat in his chambers, looking at the framed transcript from that pivotal day. Those 2 words, "Call Marcus," had exposed not just one man's crimes, but a systemic failure to protect society's most vulnerable members. Sarah knocked softly on his door. "Judge Anderson, do you have a moment?" He smiled, gesturing to a chair. "For you, always. What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about that day," she said. "About how scared I was, how impossible it seemed that anyone would believe me." "But I did believe you," he replied. "Truth has its own power, Sarah. You taught me that." She pulled out a worn piece of paper, her original statement from that day, preserved all these years. "I'm donating this to the courthouse archive for the next person who needs to find their voice." As they walked through the quiet halls of justice, Sarah remembered the frightened girl she had been. The marble walls no longer felt cold and intimidating. They echoed with a decade of truth spoken, of justice served, of lives transformed. Outside, Rachel waited with Maya and Marcus. They had dinner reservations to celebrate, not just the ceremony, but the continuing journey they shared. A journey that proved how powerful truth could be when someone was brave enough to speak it. The Truth Speaks teenagers had gone home, but their energy lingered. Tomorrow, they would return to their communities, carrying forward the legacy of courage that began in Courtroom 3B. Sarah took one last look at the courthouse before joining her family. The bronze sculpture caught the last rays of sunlight, its reaching hand eternally stretching toward hope. 2 words had started this journey, but it was the countless words spoken since, Words of truth, of courage, of change that would ensure justice continued to prevail. As they drove away, Sarah noticed new faces arriving at the downtown youth center. More children seeking safety, more stories waiting to be told, more truth waiting to be spoken. The work would continue. The voice of justice, once awakened, could never be silenced again. Want to witness more incredible stories of courage and transformation? 25 years had passed since Sarah Mitchell first spoke those two words in Courtroom 3B. The Hartford County Courthouse, now a National Historic Landmark, stood as a testament to how truth could transform society. Sarah, approaching 40, watched from her office window as a new generation of advocates entered the Mitchell Phillips Center for Child Justice. The massive building, constructed on the site of Bennett's original youth center, housed the headquarters of the nation's largest foster care advocacy network. Her phone buzzed, a message from Maya Chen, now a Supreme Court Justice, confirming their annual reunion dinner. Rachel Torres, though retired, still consulted on complex cases and would join them, along with Marcus Phillips's daughter Emma, who had followed in her father's footsteps. The Mitchell Phillips Educational Foundation had transformed countless lives. Over 50,000 former foster children had received college educations, many returning to work in child advocacy. The international reform movement, sparked by Sarah's law, had revolutionized child welfare systems globally. A knock at her door interrupted her reflection. Lisa Chen, Maya's sister and now Sarah's deputy director, entered with a young girl named Emma. The girl's eyes held that familiar mixture of fear and determination Sarah had felt 25 years ago. "I found something," Emma whispered, her voice trembling but resolute, "about the new private foster care company in Massachusetts." Sarah leaned forward, remembering her own moment of truth. "Tell me everything." Emma's revelation uncovered a modern iteration of Bennett's scheme, this time using technology and cryptocurrency to hide financial fraud. Within hours, Sarah had mobilized a task force, implementing the Phillips method of investigation that had become standard procedure worldwide. The next morning, Sarah stood before a new generation of advocates in the center's main hall. 25 years ago, I learned that truth has power beyond measure. Today, we continue that legacy. The room was filled with faces that reflected the success of their mission. Former foster children who now served as lawyers, social workers, and policymakers. Each carried their own story of transformation, their own moment of speaking truth to power. Rachel joined her daughter at the podium, her silver hair gleaming under the lights. Though retired, her passion for justice burned as bright as ever. And when Sarah first spoke those words in court, we couldn't imagine how far the ripples would spread. The evidence Emma had discovered led to swift action. Within weeks, the Massachusetts operation was shut down, its assets frozen. But more importantly, it sparked a new wave of reforms, adapting child protection laws for the digital age. Sarah's own children, adopted from the foster system, were now teenagers themselves. They had grown up understanding the power of truth and the importance of standing up for others. Her daughter Maria had already started a youth advocacy group at her high school. The annual gathering at Judge Anderson's memorial brought together survivors, advocates, and allies from around the world. The bronze sculpture of a young girl reaching toward the light had become a symbol of hope for those still fighting for justice. Maya's Supreme Court appointment had ensured that children's rights remained a priority in the nation's highest court. Her landmark decisions had strengthened protections for vulnerable youth and expanded accountability for institutional abuse. The Phillips method, refined over decades, had been integrated into law enforcement training worldwide. Marcus's vision of systematic investigation and protection had saved countless lives and prevented generations of abuse. Sarah kept a wall of letters in her office. Handwritten notes from children who had found their voice, from families reunited, from lives rebuilt. Each letter represented a story of transformation, a testament to the power of speaking up. The Mitchell Phillips Center had become more than just a building. It was a beacon of hope, a training ground for advocates, and a safe haven for those still searching for their courage to speak. As twilight fell over Hartford, Sarah joined her family and friends for their annual dinner. Rachel, Maya, Lisa, and dozens of others who had been part of their journey gathered to celebrate how far they'd come and plan for challenges ahead. They shared stories of victories and setbacks, of new threats and innovative solutions. The work was far from over, but the foundation they had built was strong. Emma's discovery had proven that vigilance was still needed. New technologies brought new ways to exploit and deceive, but they also provided new tools for exposure and accountability. Sarah raised her glass in a toast. To truth that refuses to be silenced, to courage that spans generations, and to justice that knows no bounds. The legacy lived on, not just in laws and institutions, but in the hearts of those who dared to speak up. 2 words had started a revolution, but it was the countless voices that followed that ensured its continuation. As they left the restaurant, Sarah caught sight of the courthouse silhouetted against the night sky. The place where a frightened girl had found her voice now stood as a symbol of transformation and hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles for justice. But the seeds planted 25 years ago had grown into a forest of change, providing shelter and strength for those still finding their way to truth. The revolution that began with 2 words continued, one voice at a time, echoing through generations of advocates and survivors. The truth once spoken could never be silenced again. Want more inspiring stories of justice and transformation? 2 powerful tales await your discovery. Click to continue your journey through courage, truth, and the triumph of the human spirit.